Hello students, welcome back to discussion of Chapter 6. We'll go now into the economic arguments for intervention, for government intervention. There's two main arguments, the infant industry argument and the strategic trade policy argument. So as it says there, the infant industry argument is basically the understanding that an industry should be protected until it can develop and be viable and competitive internationally by itself. This is accepted as a justification for temporary trade restrictions under the World Trade Organization. Basically, it does say that it's temporary trade restrictions. This is one of the oldest arguments made by Alexander Hamilton, 1792, not as disclosed in his musical, but in real-life situations. Protected under World Trade Organization, generally concern is that it's only good if it makes the industry efficient. If an industry always relies upon this protection, this argument, this economic protection, then they may not be able to kind of stand on their own 2 feet, for example. A case in point is the Brazilian automakers. They were at one time the 10th largest automakers in the world, but then their market share wilted away when their protection was eliminated, when they were kind of forced to stand and operate on their own. So of course this requires government financial assistance. Generally the feeling is that if the industry is a good investment today, there's global capital markets that would invest. So then there would be no need for government intervention or financial support. So that's a case, a point against this infant industry protection. But the belief is that there is that need to protect new industries from older, more mature global industries, so that one day you can compete internationally. So the big question is how much time is needed before your new industry can stand by itself and compete globally. So critics for this argue that if a country does have potential to develop a viable competitive position, its firms in that industry should be quite capable of raising necessary funds without support from the government. And we'll talk about this economic argument, infant industry argument, in the next couple of slides as well. So the next one is the strategic trade policy, which consists of two components. Basically, part A there is governments can help raise national income. So they are using subsidies to protect those promising firms in newly emerging industries that may have substantial scale economies. Governments benefit if they support their domestic firms to overcome barriers to entry created by existing foreign firms. Bombardier is an example, has greatly benefited from support from the federal and Quebec provincial government. However, people would argue as well that when funds have been withdrawn from federal funds or provincial funds have been withdrawn from Bombardier, that company does struggle. Let's go on to the next slide, the infant industry argument, just highlighting some points there. Protection of manufacturing from foreign competition does no good unless the protection helps make the industry efficient. So that's something that the nation has to address, is how to kind of stop that government support. And it does rely on the assumption that firms are unable to make their own investment decisions by borrowing money from domestic or international capital markets. Generally with the thought that governments have been required then, therefore, to subsidize long-term investments. Strategic trade policy, again, some new trade theorists have proposed the strategic trade policy argument. It is argued that by appropriate actions, a government can help raise national income if it can somehow ensure that the firm or firms that they gain that first mover advantage in such an industry. So if you can go in there and have that first mover advantage and support that, then there's some strategic element to intervening. Let's talk about GATT, the GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and some of the objectives. Basically, they want to eliminate trade or those tariffs, subsidies, imports, etc. They basically want free trade, so they don't want any government intervention. The GATT agreement includes more than 120 nations, and we can talk about some of the problems in 1980 to 1993 because they were under pressure, generally because of the three reasons cited there. There was tremendous economic success of Japan. Japan was, at that time, early 80s, the second largest economy and largest exporter. Automobiles, semiconductors, so forth. And by itself might have been enough to strain the world trading system. Generally because at that time there was at least a perception, even perhaps a reality, that the Japanese markets were off limits and closed to foreign imports through various administrative trade barriers or other barriers. So Japan was exporting but not importing, and this caused the Japanese economy to grow and other economies to struggle, because Japan would have that trade surplus, other countries would have a deficit, and it does create economic struggles. So that's one of the reasons why GATT was struggling or under pressure, because they couldn't force or encourage Japan to reduce that perception or the reality that their markets were closed. There's a trade deficit in the U.S., the world's largest economy, caused layoffs, shutdowns, companies are going out of business, people were losing their jobs. So this increased unemployment caused significant demand for more of a protectionist measures in the U.S. to protect consumer jobs. So once again, that was a reason why the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades in the World Trade Organization were under pressure, because you got countries wanting to become more protectionist and establishing more policies to prevent trade. VER, we talked about the voluntary export restraints as well. Basically, exporting countries would agree to that voluntary export restraint or quota and limit the number of exports into another country. In 1986, 16% of imports were subjected to these voluntary export restraints outside of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. In neither country, the importer or the exporter were complaining, so there's more trade barriers being put in place voluntarily, something against what nations had agreed to with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. So a lot of pressure on that agreement. The 1986 Uruguay talks, basically to extend the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade to services and to develop rules governing protection of intellectual property, to reduce agricultural subsidies, and to strengthen policing efforts. World Trade Organization was created basically to implement, monitor, police the general agreement on tariffs and trade. We can talk about some of the issues with the World Trade Organization. Basically, World Trade Organization is the police force behind or protecting and ensuring that the agreements are properly enforced. Oops, I did miss a slide there. So basically, the World Trade Organization, umbrella organization, encompassing those following bodies: TRIPS, GATS, and GATT, and they're the ones who are policing that. Let's go on to the next slide here. So they are the referee. We can look at quickly at another case, the Great Banana Wars. This is something that happened in, getting my years mixed up, in, I want to say the early 90s. But basically there was a European Union granted preferential treatment to banana producers from 71 countries in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. The US and other Latin American producers wanted to get into the European Union. They wanted to sell their bananas there. Basically, the European Union said no. The US companies and Latin American producers complained. The World Trade Organization ruled that indeed the European Union was violating trade agreements. However, the European Union refused to comply, so they complained again, and basically the European Union refused to change their trade policies, even with the World Trade Organization telling them that they were wrong a couple times. Basically, this met up with other retaliation kind of efforts by U.S. and by the Latin American producers. And just to give you a snapshot of how serious this is, if you just Google the Great Banana War, you'll find a great Wikipedia article. You can find reasons why the U.S. fought the Banana Wars. How did the Banana Wars end? Of course, no one died in the Bananas War. But how did it end? Basically, the European Union signed an agreement to formally end 8 separate World Trade Organization cases. Banana War ends after 20 years. So it's a great conflict. Let's just get back to that. Did anyone die? Okay. Massacre of 100 to 2,000 people. Wow. More serious than I thought. But it basically gives you history of that, over a fruit, and nations wanting to get into various trade deals. Oops, let's go back into the slides. 3 issues are at the forefront of the World Trade Organization: the rise of anti-dumping policies, high level of protectionism in agriculture, the lack of strong protection for intellectual property rights. If textbook adds a 4th issue, basically continued high tariffs on agricultural goods and services. And there is the new talks in Doha, which started in 2001. They are still ongoing. And basically, they're trying to determine or settle these same issues. And we can look at, I'll send you a link for the World Trade Organization news archive of current anti-dumping policies and how to lower protectionism in agriculture and protecting intellectual property rights. But that is it for Chapter 6.